In Chapter 1, we read about the Kimberley region of Western Australia, which is Australia's last frontier, a land of stunning landscapes and rich cultural heritage. Oregon explores in the first chapter of tourism indigeneity and the importance of place, the romanticized image which hides a more complex reality. The Kimberley is home to many indigenous communities whose deep connections to the land span thousands of years. For them, the land is more than geography. It's a cornerstone of their identity, spirituality, and heritage. But as tourism grows, these connections face increasing challenges. Tourism brings economic benefits and global attention to the region, yet it also risks commodifying indigenous culture. Sacred traditions and sites are often reshaped into remarkable attractions, reducing their deeper meanings to mere entertainment for visitors. He also highlights a critical issue. Heritage in the Kimberley is a contested space. Power struggles emerge as indigenous voices are sidelined in decisions about how their land and culture are represented. These conflicts expose the imbalance between preserving cultural authenticity and catering to tourism's demands. Through this chapter, Oregon sets the stage for a deeper connection about what heritage truly means. Is it a sacred trust, a commodity, or a site of cultural resistance? His work challenges us to reflect on how we engage with the places we visit and the people whose stories they hold. Chapter 1 reminds us that the Kimberley is more than a tourist destination. It's a living testament to resilience, identity, and the ongoing fight to protect the way of life. It's a call to recognize the depth behind the landscapes and to ensure that the stories we hear are told by those who live them.
Chapter 2, No One Else But Here. Carson talks about ethical clearance, a term that is required from institutions accountable as well as from modern technologies, and it's basically stating publicly that this anthropologist has positive intent and they're not pushing any agenda or trying to take advantage of these people that they're going to be studying. And it really limited their engagement with the tribes that they were studying, and it limited what they could say about and release the information that they learned about these communities. And it also talked about giving back to the communities that were sheltering them, the anthropologists. As the anthropologists, are you making any positive impacts back on their lives in exchange for allowing them to be studied? And then when they're conducting field works in the indigenous groups, are they just watching, or are they participating in the culture or making any positive contributions to these people's lives? And then besides the indigenous group, what are you giving back to the human race? Are you also sharing modern cultures with these people, or are you just viewing them from one side, which was talked about? And then what information do you learn? And you really have to, this is where they studied these people. And then after this, they talked about on Doris Street, which was a certain neighborhood in Australia. And then where Virgin highlights the diversity of Australia, because not only was it just these indigenous people, but it was also people of Asian descent, Pacific Islander descent, as well as European descent, all living within this area together without much conflict.
Chapter 3 of the book Tourism, Indigeneity, and the Importance of Place goes down into the idea of transculturality. Transculturalism is when one or two cultures will combine together for collaborative efforts and teamwork. In the chapter, it expresses how the Luru Jari Trail, a trail that is a living heritage site of the Gulari Bulu people, serves as a site for both cultural exchange, environmental, and ecological education. Over the years, the trail has been threatened under the progress and development of industrialism. Several industries have threatened the idea of destroying the trail for industrial purposes. So in order to protect the trail, both the indigenous and tourism have worked together in order to help and educate people understand the importances and values that the land has. One of the ways that the indigenous have helped preserve the land is by sharing their culture and experiences with the people who come to gaze upon the trail's beauty and enchanting wonders. Many of the tourists are mainly guided through the trail and are told the stories and the wonders that the Gulari Bulu people have had throughout the generations of them living on the land. Instead of observing from afar, it is highly encouraged that people engage with experiences that are shared by the indigenous in order to have a full understanding of what is being taught to them. Using this strategy often helps people understand the significance of the trail, which will then motivate them into preserving and protecting the land altogether.
In Chapter 4, Morgan begins by setting the groundwork for Chapter 5, with his own analysis on settler colonialism. He broke it down into 4 separate pillars: dualism, linear timing, ownership, and naming. He starts off by explaining the dualism between indigenous people, non-indigenous people, and the relationship between the two. He talks about the vulnerable nature of inviting people into their culture. Some of the repercussions that they face is environmental mismanagement, cultural degradation, and cultural appropriation. He speaks about how settler colonialism has used linear timing to dictate people's perception of reality, and how they use their own concept of ownership to diversify the land and who it belongs to, which in nature is different from the indigenous peoples. Then he goes to speak about the ownership and the naming, which is intertwined because they both work to be race and subject. With all these things, it creates a perfect environment for settler colonialism to do its job, which we'll see in a real-time example in Chapter 5.
Michael Brooks, and I covered Chapter 5, titled On Common Ground. In this chapter, the author delves deeper into life on the trail, highlighting various experiences, including interactions between people who are descendants of Petty Row, who started the tribe. This is when the author reflects on his personal involvement in their way of life, noting that he's been cooking, helping them fish, and becoming more immersed into the experience. One of the things that I noticed in this chapter was that at one point he spoke about a meeting pertaining to an election candidate campaign with about 10 people in attendance. The purpose for this campaign was to hear from locals, tourists, and business owners. Morgan emphasized that among them, there were no representatives for any indigenous group whose land that they were speaking about building upon. A lady who owned the B&B that wasn't a part of any tribe and someone who loves the land had raised concerns about the existing pollution and the inadequate infrastructure in the area. Netta confronted the candidate about her plans for infrastructure and what she was going to do about the pollution that was not only already present, but future pollution from the buildings that she wants to create. While discussing the infrastructure that she was advocating for, he specifically plans to build upon the trail. The politician had to dismiss the B&B owner's claims, saying that there was no substantial evidence to support it. I think this interaction illustrates the politician's lack of care and connection to the land. The author also emphasizes that the lady had no personal ties to the land, so it didn't seem to matter to her if a large development project were to take place. In this situation, and I think this situation puts it in perspective that you can be indigenous and not only be disadvantaged, but also dismissed in a way where they're rejecting your presence, influence, and culture. And I think that the fact that there were 2 people there advocating for the indigenous people isn't something that Petty Rowe called white magic, which is kind of just getting help from people who are just outside of your culture and that are white. In contrast, the author points out that people living on the trail are fighting to preserve their land. They're facing threats from various groups, including the government and private companies like oil and gas corporations, which are seeking to exploit the land. The people on the trail are dedicated to protecting what's theirs because their lives and their history are rooted in the land. Additionally, the author stresses the importance of community and collective effort with investments. Families within the tribe take turns maintaining and caring for the land. He refers to the individuals as custodians of the land. Even people who aren't indigenous to the area, such as visitors from the city, are invited to immerse themselves in their lifestyle. This inclusion reinforces the idea of a shared communal way of life, where no one is excluded, which what Patty Rose's vision was all along. His ultimate goal was to unite people, not just people who were of his tribe, but everybody in the community, exemplifying the village mentality that prioritizes our collective responsibility and care for one another.
Chapter 6 Knowledge and Placemaking. So, in the Wamadani James Price Point, you have the company Woodside that is trying to build a liquefied natural gas plant on the point. And originally, they're seen as a trusted renewable energy company. While they're making the plant, there's a small concern that the LNG would impact the whale migration up by the point. At first, Woodside believes that there isn't much concern at all, and they decide to still go with it, assuming that the whales would migrate naturally on their own. However, with extensive research from the Gularabalu people and the citizen scientists, they're seeing that the whales are approaching the shoreline, and that thousands of them are actually taking up as much space as possible by the LNG, which could cause concern for the whales, as they could migrate in different directions or end up, having a loss in the herd and all that. And the two groups of scientists are trying to make their claim that they need to take down the LNG. So, despite all the research and claims that they provide, Woodside still ends up having their liquefied natural gas placed by the shoreline, which upsets the locals and the Gularalubu people. But this chapter does just kind of show that during the heat of the moment, that people will challenge economic interests that would prioritize profits over environmental protection.
In his conclusion to tourism, indigeneity, and the importance of place, Carson Wergen offers a compelling exploration of how indigenous communities navigate the complex relationship between culture, land, and tourism. He reminds us that for indigenous people, the land is not just a backdrop or a resource. It is the foundation of their identity, history, and spiritual connection. Tourism then becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provides opportunities to share their stories, traditions, and ways of life with the world. It can be a tool for empowerment, a way to assert sovereignty over their narratives and celebrate their cultures by inviting visitors to engage with their communities. Indigenous peoples demonstrate resilience and pride, ensuring that their heritage is not just preserved but actively practiced and shared. But Wergen also warns of the dangers. Tourism, if unchecked, can reduce sacred traditions and rich histories to mere products for consumption. When culture becomes a commodity, the risk is not only in losing authenticity, but also in compromising the deep spiritual and ancestral ties that make these places significant in the first place. This tension is at the heart of Wergen's message. He urges us to think about tourism differently, not as an extractive industry, but as a partnership. A practice rooted in respect, where visitors come, not as consumers, but as learners and stewards. Responsible tourism must prioritize the voices and leadership of indigenous communities, safeguarding their sovereignty, cultural heritage, and the natural landscapes that are essential to their identities. Ultimately, Wergen leaves us all a call to action to see ourselves as caretakers of the places we visit, to honor the people who call these places home, and to embrace tourism as a bridge, not a barrier between cultures. It is a vision of tourism that is sustainable, respectful, and deeply human, a vision we all have a responsibility to uphold.